Stop whining. He's fine. Those were the words that almost cost this family everything. They were exhausted, the house was quiet, and their infant was finally asleep. But their dog refused to settle. He stood at the nursery door, letting out a low, pleading whimper that his owners dismissed as a nuisance. They almost closed the door to drown him out, until they finally stepped inside and felt a draft of cold air. The blanket was there, the toys were there, but the crib was empty. Stay with us, because the next 60 seconds will change the way you look at your pet forever. If you've ever ignored a dog's whimper because everything looked fine, stay with this. And if you believe animals feel danger before we can name it, subscribe, because this warning came before the panic. The whimpering started softly, not barking, not frantic. Just a low, uneven sound from the hallway that kept breaking the quiet. They were tired, the kind of tired that makes every small noise feel louder than it should. The baby had finally gone down after a long evening, and the house was settling into that fragile calm parents cling to. "Can you get him?" one of them whispered. The other sighed. "He does this sometimes." The dog stood outside the nursery door, shifting his weight, letting out another short whimper. He didn't scratch, didn't push the door. He just looked at them when they glanced his way, watching, listening, waiting. "He'll stop," one of them said quietly. "The baby's asleep." The dog whined again, softer this time, almost pleading. They ignored it. Minutes passed. The whimpering didn't stop, but it didn't escalate either. It stayed steady, rhythmic, like a signal that refused to turn into noise. "He's going to wake the baby," one of them muttered, irritation edging in. They opened the nursery door just enough to peek inside. The room looked normal. Nightlight glowing, blanket draped over the crib rail. Silence. The dog leaned forward immediately, nose pushing past them, eyes fixed on the crib. "See?" one of them whispered. "Everything's fine." The dog didn't relax. He let out another whimper, louder now. That's when one of them stepped fully into the room and froze. The crib was empty. For a moment, no one moved. The nursery light hummed softly. The nightlight cast its usual glow against the walls. The blanket hung neatly over the side of the crib, undisturbed. Too undisturbed. One of them whispered, "Where is he?" The dog let out a sharp whine and pushed past them fully now. Paws hitting the nursery floor, nose lifting, turning, searching. He didn't go to the crib again. He went straight to the floor. Sniffed. Then the doorway, then the window. Panic arrived late. It always does. They rushed to the crib, hands gripping the rails, eyes scanning the mattress as if the baby might somehow still be there if they looked hard enough. Empty. No baby, no sound. "No," one of them said out loud. "No, no, no." The dog barked once, short and directional, and ran into the hallway. "Where did he go?" the other whispered, voice breaking. The dog didn't look back. He moved fast now, nails clicking against the floor, nose low, tail rigid. He stopped near the bedroom door, sniffed sharply, then turned toward the bathroom. They followed, hearts pounding, breath coming too fast. The bathroom was empty. The dog didn't slow. He moved to the kitchen, paused briefly, then continued straight toward the back door. That was when they noticed it. The door wasn't fully shut. Not open, just not latched. One of them felt dizzy. "I locked it," they said automatically. The dog whined again, louder this time, pawing at the door. They flung it open. Cold air rushed in. Rain, mud tracked across the floor in small, uneven marks. Not footprints, drag marks. "Oh my God," one of them whispered. The dog bolted outside. They followed barefoot, not feeling the cold, not caring. The backyard light flickered on, illuminating wet grass and the faint outline of something near the fence. A blanket. The baby's blanket. Half soaked. The dog reached it first. He sniffed frantically, then turned sharply to the right, barking once, then twice. Short, urgent bursts. They ran. Past the fence line, toward the tree line where the yard dipped slightly before sloping down toward the drainage ditch beyond. The rain made everything slick. Their feet slid. Their breath tore from their chests. Please, one of them said out loud, not sure to whom. The dog stopped suddenly near the edge of the ditch and barked again, this time louder, deeper, different. They reached him and looked down. The baby was there, not crying, not moving, wrapped loosely in the blanket, half submerged in shallow water, caught against the grass where the ditch curved. Time collapsed. One of them slid down without thinking, knees hitting mud, hands plunging into cold water as they grabbed the baby. He gasped, a sharp, sudden sound. Alive. They pulled him up, clutching him tight, rubbing his back, whispering his name over and over. Water streamed from the blanket. His skin was cold, lips tinged blue, but his chest was moving, breathing. The dog stood at the edge of the ditch, barking once more, then stopped. Silence rushed in. The baby cried, loud, healthy, real. They collapsed onto the wet grass, shaking, holding him close, pressing their faces against his head, sobbing openly now. The dog approached slowly, sniffing the baby, then sitting beside them, chest heaving, eyes never leaving the child. How? One of them managed. They didn't have an answer yet. Later, much later, they would piece it together, a loose latch on the back door, a curious baby learning to stand, a moment of silence mistaken for sleep. But right now, none of that mattered. What mattered was the dog who had been whining instead of barking, the dog who had stayed steady instead of panicking, the dog who had known something was wrong long before the crib was checked. They looked at him now, soaked in muddy, sitting calmly beside them as if he hadn't just led them through the longest minute of their lives. You knew, one of them whispered. The dog didn't move, because knowing had never been the hard part. Getting them to listen had been. They didn't remember how they got back inside. Only fragments stayed clear. The weight of the baby in their arms, the sound of his crying against their chest, the dog pacing close but never touching, as if making sure the distance between danger and safety stayed closed. They wrapped the baby in dry towels, checked his breathing, his color, his eyes. Everything felt unreal, like the house had tilted and never quite settled back. The dog stayed close, not frantic, not celebratory, focused. One of them sat on the floor holding the baby, rocking gently, whispering the same words over and over. The other stood at the back door, staring at the latch like it might explain itself if they looked long enough. It hadn't been forced. That was the worst part. The latch was loose, old, something they had meant to fix but hadn't gotten around to. It clicked shut sometimes without fully catching. Just enough. They felt sick. The dog whined again, softly this time, and moved back toward the nursery. He stopped at the doorway and looked at them. Waiting. They followed. Inside, everything looked exactly as it had earlier. The blanket draped over the crib rail, the nightlight glowing, the quiet that had convinced them everything was fine. One of them stared at the crib and whispered, "How long?" They tried to reconstruct it. The baby had gone down earlier than usual. He'd been restless before sleep. Curious, pulling himself up more often lately. They'd heard the dog whimpering for several minutes before they checked. How many minutes exactly? 3? 5? Longer? They didn't know, and that uncertainty pressed on them harder than the fear had, because minutes matter. The dog moved closer to the crib and sniffed the mattress, then turned and sniffed the floor again, tracing the path toward the door with careful steps. He was still working. They realized then that his job hadn't ended at the ditch. He was accounting, making sure nothing else was wrong, making sure there wasn't another gap they hadn't seen yet. That steadiness grounded them more than anything else could have. Later, when the baby was warmed and calmer, they called the pediatrician. Then emergency services, then a family member to come sit with them. They answered questions in a haze. How long was he outside? How cold was the water? Did he lose consciousness? They answered honestly. They didn't know. The doctor told them they'd been lucky. They hated that word. Lucky implied chance. This hadn't been chance. The dog had known. They sat together after everything settled, the baby asleep on one of their chests now, the dish lying nearby, finally allowing himself to rest. One of them broke the silence. "He didn't bark," they said. The other nodded slowly. "No, he didn't. That detail stood out now. Barking would have startled them, but maybe not enough. It might have blended into normal noise, something to deal with later. The whimpering had been different, persistent, uncomfortable, impossible to ignore forever. The dog had chosen the sound that matched the situation, urgent but not panicked, directional, not chaotic. He hadn't wasted time with noise once it mattered. The moment they realized the crib was empty, he had moved. Fast, decisively, no hesitation. They realized then that the dog hadn't just been alert. He had been pacing them, holding his warning at a level they could still hear through exhaustion, raising it only when the moment required action. They looked at him lying there now, eyes half closed, chest rising and falling steadily. "You waited," one of them whispered. The dog didn't stir. He didn't need acknowledgement. He had done exactly what he needed to do. Later that night, when the house was quiet again, they lay awake replaying every second. The whimpering, the glance into the nursery, the step forward that revealed the empty crib. They felt the weight of how close they'd come to something irreversible. If they'd ignored the sound a little longer, if they'd snapped at the dog to stop, if they'd closed the nursery door to block the noise, they didn't let themselves finish those thoughts. Instead, they focused on the reality that existed now. The baby was alive, warm, safe, because the buck had refused to let silence continue. The family member who came to sit with them glanced at the dog and said quietly, "He's a good one." They nodded, but good felt too small. The dog had been the only one who knew the crib was empty before they saw it. He had been the only one counting minutes when they weren't. That night, when exhaustion finally pulled them under, the dog slept near the back door, not guarding, watching. Because even after everything, he still didn't fully trust quiet yet, and neither did they. They kept replaying the sound in their minds, not the crying, the whimpering, that low, uneven noise that had threaded through their exhaustion and irritation and almost been dismissed as background, almost been labeled nuisance, almost been silenced. They realized how close they'd come to shutting the dog out, closing the nursery door, turning up the volume, telling him firmly to stop. Any of those choices would have changed the outcome. That thought hollowed them out. They spent the next day moving through the house slowly, deliberately, as if speed itself felt dangerous now. Every door was tested, every latch pulled twice, every sound evaluated. The dog followed quietly, not leading this time, observing. He watched them check the back door again and again, watched them tighten the latch, add a temporary lock, wedge a chair beneath the handle. He didn't interfere, he let them learn. That was another thing they noticed. The dog knew when to take control and when to step back. They sat together later, the baby asleep between them, and tried to reconstruct the timeline more precisely. The baby had been laid down at 8:12. The dog's whimpering started around 8:18. They checked the nursery at 8:24. 6 minutes. 6 minutes where the crib had already been empty. 6 minutes where the mom had known and they hadn't. The weight of that knowledge pressed on them hard, because it meant the dog hadn't just reacted when the baby disappeared. He had reacted when the baby began to disappear. They realized then that the dog's whimpering hadn't been triggered by the empty crib. It had been triggered by movement, by the sound of the back door shifting, by the change in air, by the absence of a presence that should have been there. Dogs notice absence differently than humans do. We see what's in front of us. They feel what's missing. The dog had felt the absence before it became visible. They watched him now as he lay near the baby's temporary sleep space. His body was relaxed, but his nose lifted occasionally, testing the air. His ears twitched at small sounds. Still aware, still counting. They noticed how the baby reacted to him too. The baby settled more quickly when the dog was nearby. His breathing slowed, his hands unclenched. That connection hadn't changed. If anything, it felt stronger. One of them said quietly, "He knew before we did." The other nodded. "He knew before we could." That distinction mattered, because it meant the dog hadn't failed by not barking sooner. He had succeeded by choosing the right signal. They thought about how often humans equate urgency with volume, how we assume louder means more serious. The dog had proven the opposite. He had chosen persistence over volume. A sound they could ignore, but not forever. They remembered how irritated they'd been, how they'd rolled their eyes, how they'd told themselves, just a minute. That minute had almost cost them everything. They didn't speak for a long time after that. The dog shifted slightly, repositioning himself so he could see both the baby and the back door, still managing space, still bridging awareness. Later that afternoon, as sunlight filled the living room, one of them noticed the dog stand and walked toward the back door again. He sniffed, pawed once lightly, then returned and lay down. Nothing there, but he checked anyway. They followed his lead, checking the latch again. Socorenton. The dog relaxed. They realized then that the dog wasn't haunted by what had happened. He wasn't replaying it the way they were. He was processing forward. Animals don't dwell on near misses. They adjust, they adapt, they keep moving. That grounded them. They didn't want to carry fear forward. They wanted to carry attention. That night, when the baby slept again, they left the nursery door open. Not out of worry, but out of respect. They wanted to hear everything. The dog lay down nearby, head resting on his paws, eyes open but soft. The house felt different, not tense, honest. They knew now that silence wasn't neutral. It was information, and so was sound. They would never again dismiss a whimper simply because it was inconvenient, because that whimper had been the only voice counting minutes while they weren't. They reached down and rested a hand on the dog's back. "Thank you," one of them whispered. The dog's tail moved once, slow, measured, then still. He wasn't done yet, but he knew they were listening now, and that made all the difference. They didn't sleep much that night. Every small sound felt amplified now. The hum of the refrigerator, the shift of wind against the windows, the baby's breathing as it rose and fell against their chest. They weren't panicking, they were listening. The dog lay near the back door, eyes open, body relaxed but oriented, not tense, not pacing, just present. At dawn, when light finally crept in through the curtains, they stood together at the back of the house and looked outside again. The rain had washed most of the evidence away, but not all of it. The blanket still lay draped over a low branch near the fence where it had snagged. Mud clung to the fabric. Grass was flattened in a narrow line that led toward the ditch. They followed it slowly this time, step by step. The dog walked ahead, stopping occasionally to sniff the ground, then continuing. He moved with certainty, not urgency, as if retracing something he already understood. At the ditch, he stopped, sat, looked back at them. That was where he had found the baby. That was where the path ended. They stood there in silence for a long moment, the morning cool and still, the shock of the night settling into something heavier now. "He followed the trail," one of them said quietly. The other nodded. He didn't guess. The dog hadn't run wildly through the yard when they opened the door. He hadn't scattered his attention or panicked. He had tracked, from crib to door to yard to ditch, in order, with purpose. They realized then how easy it would have been for him to miss it. The yard was large. The rain had blurred scent. Darkness had hidden details. But he hadn't hesitated, because he'd been tracking the baby long before the crib was checked. The whimpering hadn't been his first warning. It had been his last. That understanding reframed everything. The dog had likely noticed the door before they did. Noticed the change in air, the unfamiliar sound of movement where there should have been none. He had followed those signals forward while they were still assuming the baby was asleep. He had known something was wrong without knowing exactly what. And instead of reacting wildly, he had chosen a path that kept leading him closer to the truth. That choice saved time they didn't realize they were losing. They returned to the house together and secured everything properly this time. New latch, secondary lock, a motion sensor by the back door. Changes they would have made earlier if they had understood the risk. They didn't blame themselves out loud. But the weight was there, because the danger hadn't come from nowhere. It had come from familiarity, from routine, from assuming that silence meant safety. The dog had never made that assumption. Later that morning, while the baby slept again, this time in their arms, they watched the dog rest nearby. For the first time since the night before, he closed his eyes fully. That mattered. because it meant he believed the immediate risk had passed. They asked a neighbor later if they had seen anything unusual the night before. The neighbors shook their head. Just rain, they said. Lots of it. No strangers, no cars, no noise. That told them something else. This hadn't been a dramatic escape. It had been quiet. The baby had likely pulled himself up. The loose latch had given way just enough. Curiosity had carried him forward. No crying, no alarm, just movement. That was the most terrifying part, because it meant the dog hadn't responded to distress. He had responded to absence. That ability saved their child. They thought about how easily the dog's whimpering could have been mistaken for nothing. How often animals communicate in ways that don't demand immediate action. Humans are trained to respond to crisis. Dogs respond to change. That difference mattered. They sat together later that afternoon, exhaustion finally catching up to them, and talked about it honestly. We almost told him to stop, one of them admitted. The other nodded. We almost chose quiet. The dog lay nearby, ears twitching occasionally, still aware but no longer urgent. They realized then that the hardest part wasn't the panic or the fear. It was the humility, accepting that the dog had known more than they did in that moment, accepting that listening had saved their child. They promised each other something then. They would never dismiss persistence again. Not from the dog, not from each other, not from that feeling in their chest that it says something isn't right even when everything looks normal. The baby slept peacefully that afternoon, longer than they expected. The dog slept too, because the path had been followed, the danger had been found, and silence finally meant what it was supposed to mean again. Once the adrenaline drained away, something heavier replaced it. Not fear, responsibility. They felt it in the quiet moments, when the baby slept peacefully against their chest, when the dog lay nearby with his head resting on his paws, when the house returned to its familiar shape, but no longer felt the same. They couldn't stop thinking about how ordinary the night had been, before it wasn't. Dinner dishes still in the sink, a show paused halfway through. The same routine they had trusted hundreds of times before. Nothing dramatic had warned them. No loud crash, no scream, no alarm, just a bike whimpering in the hallway. They sat together later that day, the baby safe between them, and talked through it slowly. If he had barked, one of them said, I would have gotten up immediately. The other nodded. Me too. They both went quiet, because that was the truth that hurt the most. They had been trained to respond to urgency, not persistence. The dog had chosen the only signal that matched the situation. A sound that said something is wrong, not something has already happened. They realized then how much trust that required. The dog had trusted them to respond. Not instantly, but in time. That trust had almost been broken. Almost. They watched the dog that afternoon as he moved through the house, checking familiar spaces with brief pauses, then continuing. He wasn't pacing anymore. He wasn't guarding. He was recalibrating, adjusting his understanding of the house the same way they were adjusting theirs. They noticed how often he returned to the back door, sniffing once, then moving away. He didn't linger. He didn't scratch. He was confirming change. Later, when the new latch was installed and the door no longer shifted even slightly, the dog tested it once more and then lay down. He accepted the update immediately. That told them something important. The dog wasn't anxious. He was responsive. He didn't carry fear forward. He evaluated conditions and adjusted accordingly. That ability impressed them more than anything else. They thought about how humans often replay mistakes endlessly, how we punish ourselves long after the danger has passed. The dog didn't do that. He moved forward. They tried to follow his lead. They didn't avoid the nursery. They didn't keep the baby wrapped tightly out of fear. They didn't close themselves off from quiet. They changed what needed changing and then let go. That balance mattered. They spent the next few days together, adjusting schedules, taking turns resting, watching the baby with renewed attentiveness that felt grounded rather than frantic. The dog stayed close but relaxed. He slept deeply now. That alone eased something in them, because if the dog could rest, they could too. One afternoon, while sunlight poured into the living room, one of them noticed the Pion's twitch in his sleep. His legs moved slightly, as if he were running in a dream. They watched him closely. He settled again. No whimpering, no tension, just rest. That image stayed with them, because it meant the dog hadn't been traumatized by the night. He had completed a task. Humans often confuse vigilance with fear. Animals don't. The dog hadn't been afraid. He had been alert, and now that alertness was no longer needed. They talked about the future too, about when the baby would start walking, about gates and locks and how easily curiosity can outpace caution, about how they would listen more closely now to each other, to the bone, behind, to the quiet signals they once dismissed. They didn't promise perfection. They promised attention that felt more realistic. One evening, as they prepared for bed, one of them paused in the doorway and looked back at the tea curled up near the baby's sleep space. "You know," they said softly, "he didn't save us by being loud." The other smiled faintly. "He saved us by refusing to give up." That was the truth. The dog had refused to stop whimpering, refused to disengage, refused to accept silence as confirmation. That refusal had bought them minutes, minutes that meant everything. They tucked the baby in that night and stood there for a moment longer than usual, watching his chest rise and fall, listening to the quiet that now felt earned. The dog lay nearby, eyes closed, breathing slow. They trusted that quiet now, not because they believed nothing could happen, but because they believed something would notice if it did, and that belief changed everything. They began to understand the whimper differently, not as a request, not as anxiety, as a boundary. The dog hadn't been saying, "Help me." He'd been saying, not yet safe, not yet settled, not yet okay to stop paying attention. That reframing changed how they heard every sound afterward. They noticed how the dog communicated in layers, how he escalated only when necessary, how he conserved urgency instead of wasting it. The whimper wasn't weakness, it was strategy. They replayed the moment again in their minds. If he had barked immediately, they might have rushed, but without clarity. They might have checked the crib quickly, assumed the baby had rolled out somehow, panicked in the wrong direction. Instead, the dog had held them in place just long enough to pull them out of routine, long enough to interrupt assumption, long enough to make them look. That mattered, because the danger hadn't been where they expected it to be. The crib hadn't collapsed. The baby hadn't cried. Nothing had signaled crisis, except the dog. They realized then how dangerous familiarity can be. The nursery was familiar, the routine was familiar, the silence was familiar, and familiarity had nearly overridden instinct. The dog had refused to let that happen. They paid closer attention to him in the days that followed, not with anxiety, but with curiosity. They watched how he responded to sound versus absence, how he reacted more strongly to gaps than to noise. When the baby cried loudly in frustration, the dog stayed calm. When the baby went silent unexpectedly, the dog moved. That pattern repeated itself enough times that it couldn't be ignored. The dog wasn't responding to distress, he was responding to disruption of expectation. That was the insight that stayed with them. Humans often wait for distress. Dogs notice deviation. That difference saved their child. They tested it gently one afternoon without meaning to. One of them left the room briefly while the baby played quietly. The dog followed to the doorway, watched the baby, then returned to lie down. Seconds later, the baby went silent in a way that didn't match play. The dog stood, immediately. They turned back and saw the baby had stopped moving, staring toward the back door again, fingers gripping the rug. Nothing dangerous yet, but moving in that direction. The dog positioned himself between the baby and the door. No sound, just placement. They intervened calmly, redirecting the baby. The dog relaxed. "That's it," one of them whispered. That's what he was doing before. Yes, he had been managing direction. Direction matters more than speed. They felt a strange mix of awe and humility watching him work through the world this way. The dog wasn't smarter than them, but he was tuned to a different frequency. He didn't get distracted by intention. He responded to trajectory. They thought again about the night the crib was empty. The dog had not needed to know how the baby got out. He'd needed to know where the baby was no longer contained. That absence had triggered everything. They began telling themselves a new rule. If the dog insists, pause. Not panic. Pause. Look. That rule applied beyond the house, too. They noticed how often they'd rush through moments that deserved a second look. How often they'd silence internal discomfort because it was inconvenient. The dog had given them permission to respect insistence. Not all alarms are loud. Some are persistent. And persistence, they learned, is harder to ignore, but easier to dismiss. They wouldn't do that again. One evening, while the baby slept and rain tapped lightly against the windows, the dog whined softly in his sleep. They both froze. Then they watched him shift, repositioning himself closer to the back door even while asleep. A reflex, a memory, but not urgency. He settled again almost immediately. They didn't get up. They didn't panic. They trusted context. That was progress. Because trust isn't the absence of fear, it's the presence of understanding. The dog had given them that. They knew now that the whimper hadn't meant something terrible is happening. It had meant, don't stop paying attention yet. And they hadn't. That was the difference. Later that night, as they lay awake listening to the baby's steady breathing, one of them said quietly, "I don't think I'll ever hear that sound the same way again." The other replied, "I don't think we're supposed to." The dog slept nearby, breathing slow, body loose. He wasn't guarding anymore, but he hadn't forgotten either. He had adapted, just like they had. The house felt safer not because danger was impossible, but because silence was no longer assumed to mean safety. That understanding settled deeply, and with it came rest. Real rest. The kind that comes after you stop lying to yourself about quiet. It took time before they trusted the quiet again. Not days, weeks. They didn't rush it. They let the house earn back its silence the same way it had lost it, gradually, honestly, without shortcuts. The dog helped with that. He didn't return to old habits overnight. For a while, he still positioned himself near the back door when the baby slept, still paused longer at thresholds, still tested latches with his nose before settling down. But there was no urgency in it now, just confirmation. They noticed how different that felt. Urgency tightens the body. Confirmation releases it. The dog would check, then lie down. Check, then sleep. Each repetition told him the same thing. Safe. One evening, while the baby slept in the nursery again for the first time since the incident, they stood in the hallway listening. Nothing, no whimpering, no movement, no alertness. The dog lay stretched out on the rug, eyes closed, breathing slow and deep. One of them whispered, "He's really sleeping." The other nodded. "That's how we know." They didn't hover over the crib. They didn't stand there waiting for something to go wrong. They let the moment be what it was. Quiet, earned quiet. That distinction mattered. The baby slept through the night. So did the dog. That was the first night it happened. They woke in the morning almost disoriented, not from fear, but from the absence of it. The house felt lighter. The air felt calmer. The dog greeted them the same way he always had, tail wagging, eyes soft, posture loose. No signs of vigilance, no residue. That surprised them more than anything. Humans carry near misses forward. Animals don't. They sat together at breakfast, the baby babbling happily in a high chair, the dog resting nearby. "I think he's done," one of them said quietly. The other smiled. "He finished his job." They realized then that the gen hadn't been guarding the baby indefinitely. He had been guarding a transition, from safety assumed to safety confirmed. Once that transition was complete, he let go. That understanding stayed with them. They noticed how differently they handled things now, not with constant worry, but with intentional awareness. Doors were checked once properly. Latches tested, then trusted. Silence acknowledged, not feared. They didn't replay the night anymore. They didn't need to. The lesson had integrated. The dog slept wherever he wanted now, sometimes near the nursery, sometimes in the living room, sometimes curled up in a spot that offered no view of doors at all. That freedom meant everything. Because animals don't abandon vigilance unless they believe it's no longer required. The dog believed that, They trusted his belief. Months later, when friends came over with their own baby, they noticed the boy show mild interest, then disengage. No staring, no positioning, no concern. He assessed quickly and moved on. That contrast reinforced everything. What had happened before hadn't been generalized anxiety. It had been targeted, specific, situational, resolved. One evening, long after the incident had faded into memory, one of them heard a sound in the house, a small thump from the back hallway. They froze. The dog didn't move. They waited. The sound didn't repeat. They smiled, because that too was information. The dog had taught them how to read the environment by watching him read it first. That gift didn't fade. They passed it on. They listened more carefully to hesitation, took persistence seriously, paused when something felt off instead of explaining it away. Not just with the dog, with each other, with themselves. That was the quiet legacy of that night. Not fear, attunement. The baby grew older, walking, running, opening things faster than they expected. New risks replaced old ones. The dog adjusted again, intervening when needed, stepping back when not, always calibrated, always honest. One night, as they tucked the child into bed, one of them paused and listened. Nothing. The dog lay asleep down the hall, completely unaware of doors or latches or past mistakes. That image felt like closure, because it meant that one no longer needed to remember. He had completed the loop. They turned off the light and went to bed. No checking, no hovering. Just rest. The house stayed quiet, not deceptive quiet, true quiet, the kind that means nothing is waiting in the shadows. The dog slept on. And so did they. They would never hear that sound the same way again. Not the bark, not the growl, the whimper. That low, uneven noise that had threaded through exhaustion and impatience and almost been silenced because it didn't sound like danger. They understood now what it had really been saying. Not help, not panic, look again. The dog hadn't known where the baby was when he first started whining. He hadn't known how far things would go. What he had known was that something essential was missing from where it should have been. And that absence mattered more than noise ever could. They thought about how often humans rely on confirmation, how we wait to see the problem before we act, how we assume things are fine because nothing is screaming at us yet. The dog had never needed confirmation. He had responded to discrepancy. The crib was quiet in the wrong way. The air moved differently. The pattern broke. That was enough. They realized then that the most dangerous moments aren't loud. They're smooth. They slide forward without resistance because nothing feels urgent yet. The baby hadn't cried. The door hadn't slammed. The house hadn't announced anything wrong. Only the dog had noticed, and only because he refused to accept that silence meant safety. They carried that understanding forward into everything. When the child grew older and moved faster, they noticed the dog whimper once when a gate wasn't latched properly. Another time when a door was left cracked just a little too wide. Each time, the sound came before anything happened. Each time they listened. Each time nothing happened because they listened. That was the quiet miracle of it. The dog didn't need another dramatic rescue. He had already taught them how to prevent the next one. Years passed. The story softened at the edges, but the lesson stayed sharp. They never framed it as a moment of terror when they told it later. They framed it as a moment of choice. A choice to ignore a sound that was inconvenient, or a choice to stop and look again. They were grateful every day that they had chosen the second. The dog aged gracefully. Slower now, grayer around the muzzle. His naps stretched longer, his movements less urgent, but the instinct never left him. It simply became quieter. One night, long after the child was sleeping soundly in his own bed, the dog lifted his head slightly, let out a single soft whimper in his sleep, then settled again. They heard it, they smiled, not with fear, with understanding, because they knew what it meant. Not something is wrong, but pay attention. And they did. They always would. The house felt complete now, not perfect, not invulnerable, but honest. Doors were secure, silence was earned, and listening had become instinct again. They tucked the child in that night and stood for a moment longer than necessary, watching his chest rise and fall. The dog lay nearby, eyes closed, breathing slow. No vigilance, no watching, just rest. That was the final proof. The word had never been dramatic. He had been precise, and precision had saved their child when noise would have come too late. They ignored the dog's whimpers until they realized he was the only one who knew the crib was empty. If this story made you rethink the sounds you almost brushed off, subscribe for more true dog guardian stories like this. Because sometimes the warning that saves a life doesn't shout, it waits for you to listen.